Welcome, fellow seekers of hidden truths. Before we descend into the shadows of November 1963, I want to connect with you, wherever you are in this vast world of ours. How has your day been treating you? Are you listening as the sun sets where you are? Or perhaps in the quiet hours when the rest of the world sleeps? Whether you're tuning in from bustling New York, the misty highlands of Scotland, the neon-lit streets of Tokyo, or anywhere else this story might find you, know that you're not alone in questioning the official narratives we've been fed. What time is it where you are? Are you settling in for the night, or stealing a moment during your lunch break to explore the mysteries that keep us awake? Wherever you are, whatever time has brought you here, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend it with us. If stories like this one, tales that dig beneath the surface of accepted history, resonate with you, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories. We're building a community of curious minds who refuse to accept simple answers to complex questions. Hit that subscribe button, because the truth is always stranger than fiction, and there are so many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Now, let me introduce you to a dying man's confession, a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about that terrible day in Dallas. My name doesn't matter anymore. I'm dying, and the cancer eating through my lungs has given me a clarity I never had in life. They say confession is good for the soul, and if that's true, then perhaps I can find some peace in these final weeks by telling you what I know about November 22nd, 1963. I wasn't in Dallas that day. I was 26 years old, fresh out of Yale with a degree in mathematics and a head full of patriotic idealism. The CIA had recruited me for their data analysis division. A clean job for clean hands, they said. I was supposed to crunch numbers, analyse patterns, help keep America safe from the Red Menace. What I didn't know was that some patterns, once seen, can never be unseen. I remember exactly where I was when the news broke. Third floor of the Langley building, in what we called the fish tank, a glass-walled office where junior analysts like me sorted through intelligence reports. The secretary, Mrs. Henderson, came running in with her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. "The president's been shot," she whispered. The world stopped. Not just for me, not just for our office, but for everyone. You could feel it in the air, a sudden absence, like the moment after lightning strikes but before the thunder reaches you. We all crowded around the television set they wheeled into our floor, watching Walter Cronkite deliver the news that would change everything. But here's what you need to understand. My real education about that day didn't come from CBS News. It came 3 weeks later, when I was assigned to a classified task force reviewing all available footage and witness testimony related to the assassination. They told us we were helping with the official investigation, ensuring that every piece of evidence was properly catalogued and analysed. That's when I first saw the real Zapruda film, not the version they showed the public. Not the version that's been analysed frame by frame by conspiracy theorists and debunkers alike. I saw the original, unedited, unredacted, in a clarity that made my stomach lurch and my hands shake. There weren't 2 shots, there weren't 3, there were echoes, and in those echoes, bouncing off the buildings of Dealey Plaza like secrets ricocheting through history, the truth was buried so deep that 57 years later, I'm still the only person willing to speak it aloud. The motorcade had been perfect that morning. Sunny skies, enthusiastic crowds, the President and First Lady radiant in the back of that damned Lincoln Continental, Jackie in her pink Chanel suit, the same suit that would soon be stained with her husband's blood and brains. The President waving, that familiar smile lighting up his face as he acknowledged the cheers of Dallas citizens who had come to see Camelot in person. I've watched that footage thousands of times, frame by frame, second by second, looking for something, anything, that might have been different. Some sign that could have warned them, could have changed the course of history. But evil rarely announces itself with fanfare. It lurks in shadows, behind grassy knolls, in the hearts of men who believe their cause justifies any action. At 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, as the motorcade made that fatal turn onto Elm Street, the United States of America died along with its president. What emerged from the smoke and chaos wasn't the same country. It was something else, Something that could keep secrets this dark for this long. Lee Harvey Oswald. The name still makes my chest tighten, not because of what he did, but because of what he didn't do, or rather, what he couldn't have done alone. The official story is seductive in its simplicity. A lone gunman, a disgruntled Marxist with delusions of grandeur and a cheap Italian rifle, acting out his twisted fantasies from the 6th floor of the Texas Schoolbook Depository. Clean, contained, case closed. But I've read the classified files. I've seen the surveillance reports that were never meant to see daylight. And I can tell you that Lee Harvey Oswald was many things. A confused young man, a wannabe revolutionary, a lousy shot. But he was never acting alone. The CIA had been watching Oswald since his defection to the Soviet Union in 1959. Not casual observation, active surveillance. They knew when he returned to the United States with his Russian wife Marina. They knew about his pro-Castro activities in New Orleans. They knew about his contacts with anti-Castro Cuban exiles. They knew about his mysterious trip to Mexico City just weeks before the assassination, where he allegedly tried to get visas to Cuba and the Soviet Union. They knew, and yet they did nothing to stop him. Or did they? I've seen the internal memos written in the careful bureaucratic language that intelligence agencies use to hide their sins. Oswald wasn't just being watched. He was being managed, guided, used. The morning of November 22nd, Oswald rode to work with a colleague named Buell Wesley Fraser. He carried a long package, wrapped in brown paper. When Fraser asked what it was, Oswald said curtain rods for his apartment. After the assassination, that package became the murder weapon, a 6.5mm Carcano rifle, allegedly purchased by mail order under the alias A. Heidel. But here's what the Warren Commission didn't tell you. The FBI ballistics experts initially couldn't match the bullets found in Dealey Plaza to Oswald's rifle. The chain of custody for the so-called magic bullet, Commission Exhibit 399, was so compromised that it wouldn't have been admissible in any legitimate court of law. And multiple witnesses in the book depository reported seeing Oswald in the second-floor lunchroom both before and immediately after the assassination, calmly drinking a Coca-Cola. When Officer Marion Baker and Building Supervisor Roy truly encountered Oswald in that lunchroom just 90 seconds after the shooting, he wasn't out of breath. He wasn't sweating. He wasn't acting like a man who had just committed the crime of the century and then run down 4 flights of stairs. He was drinking a Coke. They arrested him anyway. Not for assassinating the president, they didn't have enough evidence for that yet, but for killing Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit, who had been shot across town about an hour after the assassination. The case against Oswald for Tippit's murder was almost as shaky as the case for Kennedy's assassination, but it gave them a reason to hold him while they manufactured the evidence they needed. For 2 days, Oswald maintained his innocence. "I'm just a patsy," he told the press as they paraded him through the Dallas Police Department like a trophy. Those 4 words have haunted me for decades, because I believe they were the truest thing anyone said about the assassination in those first terrible days. Oswald was a patsy, but he was a carefully chosen patsy, with just enough suspicious connections and radical associations to make him believable as a lone gunman. His time in the Soviet Union made him a communist. His pro-Castro leafleting made him a radical. His Marine Corps service made him a trained marksman. Never mind that his shooting scores were consistently mediocre. Most importantly, his psychiatric profile, and yes, the CIA had one, indicated that he was exactly the kind of unstable personality who might crack under pressure and reveal inconvenient truths about who had really recruited him and why. That's why Jack Ruby had to kill him. Abraham Zapruda was an amateur filmmaker who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. His 8mm Bell & Howell camera captured 26.6 seconds of footage that would become the most analysed piece of film in human history. What the public saw, however, was not what Zapruda actually recorded. I was one of 7 CIA analysts assigned to review the complete, unedited Zapruda film in December 1963. We worked in a windowless room in the basement of Langley, with armed guards at the door and strict instructions that nothing we saw was to be discussed with anyone outside our immediate team. Even among ourselves, we were discouraged from speculation or interpretation. We were simply to catalogue what we observed frame by frame and submit our reports to our supervisor, a thin, chain-smoking man named James Jesus Angleton, who ran the CIA's counterintelligence division. The version of the Zapruda film that was eventually released to the public was missing crucial frames. Not randomly missing, strategically excised. The missing segments, totalling nearly 40 seconds of additional footage, showed details that would have made the lone gunman theory impossible to maintain. In the complete film, you could see the president's head snap violently backward and to the left when the fatal shot struck him. The physics were unmistakable. The bullet had come from the front, not from Oswald's position behind and to the right of the motorcade. But more damning than the head movement was what the camera captured in the background, behind the wooden picket fence on the grassy knoll. A puff of gun smoke. It was visible for less than a second, a small white cloud drifting up from behind the fence just as the president's head exploded. In 1963, ammunition still contained enough sulfur and potassium nitrate to produce visible smoke when fired. The Warren Commission would later claim that modern ammunition didn't produce smoke, but that was a lie. I've seen the ballistics test they conducted. They knew the ammunition from that era produced visible discharge. They also knew that multiple witnesses had reported seeing and smelling gunpowder behind the grassy knoll. Julia Ann Mercer reported seeing men with rifles near the overpass. Gordon Arnold, a soldier on leave, claimed a shot was fired directly over his head from behind the fence. S.M. Holland, a railroad supervisor, ran to the fence immediately after the shooting and found footprints and cigarette butts behind it, as if someone had been waiting there. But the most compelling witness was never called to testify before the Warren Commission. Her name was Beverly Oliver, and she was standing directly across from the grassy knoll when the shooting began. She told FBI agents that she saw a man in a dark suit fire a rifle from behind the wooden fence. Her interview was classified at the highest levels. I saw the transcript. I watched the whole thing, she had told the agents. There was a man behind that fence, and he shot President Kennedy. I saw the smoke, I heard the crack of the rifle, and I saw him run away toward the railroad tracks. Why won't anybody listen to me? They weren't listening because they couldn't afford to listen. Beverly Oliver's testimony, combined with the unedited Zapruda film, would have proven beyond any doubt that there was a conspiracy to kill the president. Instead, her interview was buried in a classified file that wouldn't be declassified until 2039, 75 years after the assassination. The missing frames from the Zapruda film weren't the only evidence that disappeared. The original autopsy photographs taken at Bethesda Naval Hospital showed the back of the president's head blown away, consistent with a shot from the front. But the photographs that were released to the Warren Commission had been retouched to make it appear that the exit wound was on the right side of his head, consistent with the shot from behind. I know this because I was present when the photo analysis team compared the original hospital photographs to the retouched versions that were being prepared for the commission. The differences were stark and unmistakable. The original photo showed a massive exit wound in the back of the skull. The retouched version showed the same wound moved to the right side. When I asked my supervisor about the discrepancy, he looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes that had seen too many secrets, and said, "Sometimes, son, the truth isn't in the national interest." The question that haunted me then, and haunts me still, is not whether there was a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is, who was behind it? The answer, I believe, is that it wasn't one group acting alone. It was a convergence of interests, a shadow network of powerful men who saw Kennedy as a threat to their power and decided that the threat had to be eliminated. At the centre of this network was the Central Intelligence Agency, specifically the Counterintelligence Division, run by James Jesus Angleton. Angleton was a brilliant, paranoid man who saw communist plots everywhere and believed that the ends always justified the means. He had been instrumental in developing the CIA's assassination capabilities through programs like MKULTRA and Operation Phoenix. More importantly, Angleton was furious with Kennedy over the Bay of Pigs invasion. When the CIA's Cuban exile army was being slaughtered on the beaches of Cuba in April 1961, they begged Kennedy to provide air support. Kennedy refused, effectively dooming the invasion and humiliating the agency. In the aftermath, Kennedy reportedly told a friend that he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. That statement, more than any other, signed his death warrant. But the CIA wasn't acting alone. They had allies in the military-industrial complex who were equally threatened by Kennedy's policies. The president had made it clear that he intended to withdraw American advisors from Vietnam, ending what promised to be a very profitable war for defense contractors. He had also begun pursuing détente with the Soviet Union, which threatened to end the Cold War, and with it, the justification for massive defense spending. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff, once described Kennedy's policies as almost treasonous. General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had presented Kennedy with a plan called Operation Northwoods, a scheme to stage false flag terrorist attacks against American civilians and blame them on Cuba, providing justification for a full-scale invasion. Kennedy rejected Operation Northwoods in horror, but the plan's existence proved that the military leadership was willing to kill American civilians to achieve their geopolitical objectives. If they draft a plan to kill innocent Americans to start a war, what made us think they'd stop at a president who stood in their way? The third leg of this unholy alliance was organised crime. The Mafia had been useful partners for the CIA in various operations, including attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. But Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, had declared war on organised crime, launching an unprecedented crackdown on Mafia operations across the country. Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans crime boss, had reportedly told associates that the way to stop Bobby Kennedy was to cut off the head of the dog, meaning kill the president. Sam Giancana, the Chicago boss who had helped rig the 1960 election for Kennedy, felt betrayed by the administration's attacks on his organization. Santo Traficante, the Tampa boss with extensive Cuban connections, had both personal and professional reasons to want Kennedy dead. The beauty of this convergence was that each group provided the others with plausible deniability. If the conspiracy was ever exposed, each faction could point fingers at the others. The CIA could blame rogue military officers, the military could blame the Mafia could blame anti-Castro Cubans. But there was one more player in this deadly game, one whose involvement I only discovered years later when I was deep into my own investigation, the Federal Reserve. On June 4th, 1963, Kennedy signed Executive Order 11,110, which authorized the Secretary of the Treasury to issue silver certificates backed by silver bullion, bypassing the Federal Reserve System entirely. If this policy had been fully implemented, it would have fundamentally challenged the Fed's monopoly on currency creation. The order was never rescinded after Kennedy's death, but it was never implemented either. It simply disappeared from the policy agenda, like so many of Kennedy's other initiatives. One name kept surfacing in all of these connections: David Atlee Phillips, a CIA officer who specialized in propaganda and disinformation. Phillips had worked on anti-Castro operations, had connections to organized crime figures, and had been present in Mexico City when Oswald allegedly visited the Soviet and Cuban consulates. More importantly, Phillips matched the description given by several witnesses who reported seeing a man who looked like Oswald meeting with mysterious handlers in the weeks before the assassination. When these witnesses were shown photographs of the real Oswald after the assassination, several said that wasn't the man they'd seen. Was David Atlee Phillips impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald? Was he running a false flag operation designed to implicate the Soviet Union and Cuba in Kennedy's assassination? I never found definitive proof, but the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. What I did find was a pattern of compartmentalized operations, each designed to achieve a specific objective while maintaining plausible deniability for the others. Oswald was the patsy, set up to take the blame. The real shooters were professionals, probably Cuban exiles with CIA training. The cover-up involved elements of the FBI, the Secret Service, and the Warren Commission itself. And at the centre of it all was a simple truth that I've carried with me for 57 years. John F. Kennedy wasn't killed by a lone gunman. He was executed by a shadow government that couldn't tolerate his vision of a more peaceful world. Jack Ruby was supposed to be a simple man with a simple motive, a patriotic nightclub owner so overcome with grief and rage at Kennedy's assassination that he spontaneously decided to kill the accused assassin. At least that's the story they wanted us to believe. But I've read Ruby's FBI file, and Jack Ruby was anything but simple. Born Jacob Leon Rubenstein in Chicago, he had been involved with organised crime since the 1940s. He ran guns to anti-Castro Cuban exiles. He was connected to Carlos Marcello's New Orleans operation and Santa Traficante's Tampa organisation. Most importantly, he had been an FBI informant since the early 1950s, providing information about communist activities in the labour unions. Ruby's decision to kill Oswald wasn't spontaneous. It was calculated, necessary, and ordered from above. Think about the logistics. On the morning of November 24th, 1963, Ruby left his apartment with his dog, Sheba. He drove to the Western Union office to wire money to one of his employees. Then, instead of returning home or going to his nightclub, he walked to the Dallas Police Department, descended to the basement, and positioned himself perfectly to intercept Oswald as he was being transferred to the county jail. The official timeline suggests that Ruby's decision was spur of the moment, but the evidence tells a different story. Ruby had been asking questions about Oswald's transfer schedule for 2 days. He knew exactly when and where Oswald would be moved. He was in position waiting when the transfer began. More suspiciously, Ruby had been seen talking to several Dallas police officers in the days between the assassination and Oswald's murder. He had distributed sandwiches and coffee to reporters and cops working around the clock on the case. He was building relationships, establishing his presence, making sure he would be recognised and trusted when the moment came. The moment came at 11:21 a.m. on November 24th. As Oswald was led through the basement of the Dallas Police Department, Ruby stepped forward and fired a single shot into Oswald's abdomen with a .38 caliber Colt Cobra revolver. Oswald died 2 hours later at Parkland Hospital, the same hospital where President Kennedy had been pronounced dead 2 days earlier. Ruby's first words after shooting Oswald were telling, "You all know me, I'm Jack Ruby." He wasn't introducing himself. He was reminding the officers that he was one of them, a trusted informant who had just performed a service for the greater good. But Ruby's mental state deteriorated rapidly after his arrest. He became paranoid, claiming that Jews around the world would be killed because of what he had done. He begged to be taken to Washington so he could tell his story to federal authorities. He insisted that there was more to the assassination than the public knew. "Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface," Ruby told the Warren Commission during his testimony. "The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. The people who had so much to gain and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in the position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world." When Chief Justice Earl Warren asked him to elaborate, Ruby became increasingly agitated. "I want to tell the truth, and I can't tell it here," he said. "If you don't take me back to Washington tonight to give me a chance to prove to the President that I am not guilty of this, then you will see the most tragic thing that will ever happen." Warren refused to take Ruby to Washington. 3 years later, Ruby died in prison of a pulmonary embolism, taking his secrets with him to the grave. But before he died, Ruby made several statements that haunt me to this day. He told his psychiatrist that the assassination was an act of overthrowing the government. He told a reporter that the world will never know the true facts of what occurred. Most chillingly, he told his rabbi, "I did it for the American people." What did Ruby mean by that? Did he genuinely believe that killing Oswald would spare the American people from learning terrible truths about their government? Or was he simply following orders from his handlers, who had convinced him that silencing Oswald was a patriotic duty? I believe the answer lies in a classified FBI memo that I discovered years later, buried in files that were supposed to have been destroyed. The memo, dated November 25th, 1963, stated, "Subject's actions prevented comprehensive interrogation of primary suspect. This development serves operational security interests and reduces risk of exposure for sensitive assets." In bureaucratic language, the memo was saying that Ruby had successfully prevented Oswald from revealing information that could have exposed CIA operations and agents. Ruby hadn't acted out of patriotic grief. He had acted to protect a conspiracy that went to the highest levels of the American government. The Jack Ruby problem wasn't that he killed Oswald. The problem was that by killing Oswald, he made it impossible to ever get to the truth of who was behind the assassination, and that, I believe, was exactly the point. By the spring of 1964, I was beginning to understand that I had stumbled into something far larger and more dangerous than a simple assassination. The Kennedy killing wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic elimination of anyone who might threaten the new order that was emerging from the ashes of Camelot. The deaths began almost immediately after the assassination, and they followed a pattern that was too consistent to be coincidental. Witnesses, investigators, and journalists who had gotten too close to the truth started dying in accidents, suicides, and mysterious illnesses at a rate that defied statistical probability. Dorothy Kilgallen was a prominent journalist and game show panelist who had become obsessed with the Kennedy assassination. She was the only reporter to interview Jack Ruby privately, and she told friends that she was going to break the real story behind the assassination. In November 1965, she was found dead in her New York apartment, allegedly from an overdose of alcohol and barbiturates. The notes from her Ruby interview were never found. David Ferry was a bizarre figure, a former pilot, private investigator, an associate of both Lee Harvey Oswald and New Orleans crime boss Carlos Marcello. Ferry had been questioned by the FBI about his possible connections to the assassination, and he was a key figure in New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison's investigation. In February 1967, just as Garrison was preparing to charge him as a conspirator, Ferry was found dead in his apartment. The official cause of death was a brain aneurysm, but the timing was suspicious. Mary Pinchot Meyer was perhaps the most significant casualty of the post-assassination cleanup. Meyer had been President Kennedy's mistress, but more importantly, she was a vocal opponent of the CIA and had been pressuring Kennedy to end American involvement in Vietnam. She was also the ex-wife of CIA official Cord Meyer, which gave her insider knowledge of agency operations. In October 1964, Meyer was shot and killed while walking along the Potomac River in Georgetown. A black man named Ray Crump Jr. was arrested for the murder, but he was acquitted when the prosecution couldn't establish a motive or place him at the scene with the murder weapon. The case was never solved. What made Meyer's death especially suspicious was what happened afterward. CIA counterintelligence chief James Jesus Angleton, the same man who supervised my analysis of the Zapruda film, personally searched Meyer's house and studio looking for her diary. He found it and, according to his later testimony, destroyed it. What secrets had Mary Meyer recorded in that diary? What had she learned from Kennedy about his plans to dismantle the CIA and end the Cold War? We'll never know, because Angleton made sure those secrets died with her. The pattern continued throughout the 1960s and beyond. Reporters who investigated the assassination died in car accidents. Witnesses who contradicted the official story committed suicide. FBI agents who questioned the evidence suffered heart attacks. By 1967, a statistician named Richard Charnin calculated that the odds of so many assassination-related witnesses dying of unnatural causes were 100 billion to 1. I began to realise that I was in danger myself. In early 1965, I was quietly transferred from the assassination analysis team to a desk job in the agency's administrative division. My security clearance was downgraded, my access to classified materials was restricted, and I was told that my previous work was now need to know, and I no longer needed to know. But I had already seen too much. I had copies of documents that I wasn't supposed to have. I had photographs of the unedited Zapruda film frames. I had witness statements that contradicted the Warren Commission's findings, and I had a growing certainty that powerful forces within the American government had murdered the president and were systematically eliminating anyone who might expose their crime. The final straw came in 1968, when Robert Kennedy announced his candidacy for president. I watched Bobby's campaign with a mixture of hope and terror, knowing that if he won, he would have the power to reopen the investigation into his brother's death. I was certain that the same forces that had killed Jack would never allow Bobby to reach the White House. I was right. On June 5th, 1968, Robert Kennedy was shot and killed in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, allegedly by a lone gunman named Sirhan Sirhan. But witnesses reported hearing more shots than Sirhan's gun could fire, and the autopsy showed that Bobby had been shot from behind at close range, while Sirhan was in front of him and never got closer than 3 feet. The night Bobby Kennedy died, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I stopped investigating. I stopped asking questions. I locked my copies of the documents in a safe deposit box, resigned from the CIA, and disappeared into the anonymous world of private sector consulting. For 30 years I told myself that I was protecting my family, that the truth wasn't worth dying for, that someone else someday would expose the conspiracy and bring the killers to justice. But no one ever did. The files remain sealed, the witnesses are all dead. And the truth about November the 22nd, 1963, is buried so deep that most people have stopped looking for it. That's why I'm telling you this story now. Because I'm dying, and the cancer in my lungs has liberated me from fear. They can't kill me any more effectively than the disease already is, and maybe, just maybe, someone will read this and understand that the official story of the Kennedy assassination is a lie. 57 years have passed since that November day in Dallas, and I'm finally ready to tell the complete truth. The doctors say I have weeks, maybe days left. The cancer has spread from my lungs to my liver, my bones, my brain. Death is no longer a distant possibility. It's a current resident, setting up house in my body and preparing to take permanent possession. In these final days, I find myself thinking constantly about President Kennedy and what his death meant for America. He wasn't a perfect man. No politician ever is. But he represented something that died with him in Dealey Plaza. Hope. The possibility that government could serve the people rather than hidden interests. The belief that America could choose peace over perpetual war. The men who killed him weren't driven by patriotism or national security concerns. They were motivated by fear. Fear that Kennedy would dismantle their power structures, end their profitable wars, and expose their crimes to the American people. They wrapped their conspiracy in the flag and called it patriotism, but it was really just murder in service of maintaining control. I kept souvenirs of my investigation, hidden away for more than half a century. Photographs, documents, witness statements, evidence that could have changed history if I had been brave enough to release it when it mattered. Now, as I prepare to face whatever comes after this life, I've decided that the truth deserves to see daylight, even if it's too late to matter. The most important piece of evidence I preserved is a single frame from the original Zapruda film, frame 313, the moment of the fatal headshot. In the version released to the public, you can see the president's head snap backward, but the background is blurred and indistinct. In the original frame that I copied before it was altered, you can clearly see a puff of white smoke rising from behind the wooden fence on the grassy knoll. That smoke proves beyond any doubt that there was a second gunman. It proves that Lee Harvey Oswald, whatever his role in the conspiracy, did not act alone. It proves that the Warren Commission's conclusion was wrong, whether through incompetence or deliberate deception. But more than that, it proves that our government lied to us about the most important crime in American history. And if they lied about this, what else have they lied about? What other crimes have been committed in the name of national security? What other truths have been buried to protect the powerful? I think about the America that John Kennedy envisioned, a country that could put a man on the moon, end the Cold War, and guarantee civil rights for all its citizens. That America died with him in Dallas, replaced by a darker version that wages endless wars, spies on its own citizens, and serves corporate interests above the common good. The conspiracy to kill Kennedy wasn't just about stopping one man. It was about stopping an idea, the idea that government should serve the people rather than hidden elites. The bullets that shattered his skull also shattered the promise of American democracy. And yet, I still believe in that promise. I still believe that the truth matters, even when it's inconvenient or dangerous. That's why I'm telling this story now, why I'm finally breaking the silence I've maintained for nearly 6 decades. You can choose not to believe me. You can dismiss this as the ravings of a dying old man, the fantasies of someone whose mind has been addled by cancer and medication. But I ask you to consider this. Who benefited when Camelot fell? Who gained power when Kennedy died? Who profited from the wars he wanted to end and the military spending he wanted to reduce? The answer to those questions will tell you everything you need to know about November 22nd, 1963. I've arranged for the evidence I preserved to be released after my death. The photographs, the documents, the witness statements, all of it will be made public through channels that can't be suppressed or discredited. It may not change anything. The official story has had 57 years to become accepted truth, and most people are comfortable believing what they've always believed. But for those who still care about the truth, who still believe that justice matters even when it's delayed, the evidence will be there. Make of it what you will. As for me, I'm ready to join the long list of people who knew too much about the Kennedy assassination. The difference is that I'm dying of natural causes, not a mysterious accident or sudden suicide. Cancer may be a terrible way to die, but at least it's honest. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. In my final days, I've been thinking about what President Kennedy said in his inaugural address. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. I spent my career serving my country, believing that I was protecting America from its enemies. It took me decades to realize that sometimes the greatest enemies are the ones who claim to be patriots, while they destroy the very foundations of the republic they claim to serve. The truth about the Kennedy assassination isn't just about one tragic day in Dallas. It's about the moment America lost its way, when secret government became more powerful than democratic government, when fear became more important than hope. The president they killed in Dallas wasn't perfect, but he represented the best of what America could be. The men who killed him represented the worst of what America had become, and in the smoke that rose from Dealey Plaza, the truth disappeared. But truth has a way of surviving, even when buried under layers of lies and deception. Somewhere in the classified files that won't be released until 2039, the complete story waits to be told. Somewhere in the memories of aging witnesses and the consciences of former conspirators, fragments of truth persist. Maybe someday, when all of us who lived through those terrible days are gone, someone will piece together the complete picture. Maybe someday, the full scope of the conspiracy will be revealed, and the American people will finally understand what was done in their name on that November day in Dallas. Until then, I offer you this deathbed confession of a dying man who spent his career in the shadows of power, and finally chose to step into the light. I can't prove everything I've told you, but I can swear to you that every word is true as I understand it. The third bullet, the one that came from the grassy knoll, the one that snapped Kennedy's head back and to the left, the one that proved there was a conspiracy, that bullet didn't just kill a president. It killed the America we thought we knew. In the end, that may be the most tragic casualty of November 22nd, 1963. Not just John Fitzgerald Kennedy, but the faith of the American people in their own government, the belief that their leaders told them the truth, the confidence that justice would prevail and the guilty would be punished. They buried that faith with the president in Arlington National Cemetery, and we've been living with the consequences ever since. I've carried this knowledge for 57 years, and now I'm passing it on to you. What you do with it is up to you. But remember this, in a democracy, the truth belongs to the people, not to the powerful men who would hide it from them. The smoke cleared from Dealey Plaza long ago, but the echoes of those gunshots still reverberate through American history. Listen carefully, and you can hear them even now, the sound of a republic dying, one secret at a time. My name doesn't matter. I'll be gone soon, just another casualty of time and disease. But the truth I've told you will survive, because truth has a way of outlasting the lies that try to bury it. The president they killed that day in Dallas was trying to build a better world. The least we can do is try to understand why they stopped him. And maybe, just maybe, we can finish what he started. Settle in as we explore what might be lurking beneath those peaceful cornfields. The radio transmitter hummed to life with a familiar electric wheeze, its vintage dials glowing amber in the dimness of the shed. Mattie Connors wiped dust from the frequency display, her fingers leaving clean trails across the aged panel. Her father's ancient ham radio equipment had sat untouched for nearly a decade, but tonight, on her 25th birthday, seemed like the perfect time to resurrect it. "Come on, old friend," she whispered, turning the tuning knob delicately. "Let's see if you still work." Outside, beyond the weathered walls of the equipment shed, cornstalks whispered in the summer night. The Connors farm stretched for 40 acres in all directions, a modest plot by Iowa standards, but enough to keep her father in business after her mother passed. Enough to keep Mattie trapped in Granger when her engineering scholarship fell through. Enough empty space to broadcast music that no one would hear. The transmitter's needle jumped, finding power. Static hissed through the speakers. Mattie checked her phone's FM radio app, searching for an empty frequency to experiment with. Most of the dial was dead air this far from Des Moines, just how she wanted it. She settled on 88.1 FM, twisted the broadcast dial to match, and waited. The static changed. Not suddenly, but in such a subtle shift that she almost missed it. The white noise acquired rhythm, a soft, regular thump that reminded her of a heartbeat, but mechanical, precise, too regular for anything natural. "That's weird," she muttered, checking connections. The transmitter wasn't actually broadcasting yet. It was receiving. The rhythmic pulse continued, now joined by a faint high-pitched tone that danced above the lower beat. It reminded her of the harmonic pattern generators she'd built during her brief engineering stint at Iowa State. The sound was almost mathematical in its precision. Mattie glanced at her watch. 3:33 a.m. She grabbed her phone and started recording, holding the microphone close to the radio's speaker. After a full minute, the signal abruptly cut off, returning to pure static. Back in her bedroom, Mattie downloaded the audio file and opened her sound editing software. She hadn't used these programs since dropping out of college, but some skills never quite disappeared. She ran the signal through a spectrogram analysis, watching as the visual representation of the sound materialized on her screen. What she saw made her sit back in her chair. The patterns weren't random. The high-pitched overtones, when mapped visually, created distinct numerical sequences. First 7 prime numbers, then what appeared to be the beginning of a Fibonacci sequence. This wasn't terrestrial interference or random cosmic noise. This was structured, intelligent. "What the hell?" she whispered, running the analysis again. By sunrise, Mattie had created 3 different spectrograms and converted portions of the signal into numerical values. She'd spent hours on Reddit forums for audio engineers and amateur astronomers, eventually posting her findings with a simple question. Found weird signal on 88.1 FM in rural Iowa. Any ideas what this could be? She attached the audio file and her preliminary analysis before collapsing into bed, the morning chores temporarily forgotten. Her last conscious thought was that she should check the frequency again the following night. When she woke at noon, her post had been removed, not just downvoted or flagged, completely gone, as if it had never existed. Her browser history showed she'd visited the site, but the post itself had vanished. More disturbing still, the audio file she'd uploaded to her cloud drive was gone too. "Dad," she called, heading downstairs, "did you use my computer this morning?" Walter Connors sat at the kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug. At 63, he maintained the stoic demeanour of someone who had spent a lifetime watching seeds grow into crops, only to be harvested and planted again. Patience lived in the creases around his eyes. "Didn't touch it," he replied, not looking up from his newspaper. "Why?" "Some files went missing," Mattie said, pouring herself coffee. "Weird stuff I recorded last night on your old radio setup." Her father's hand stilled, coffee mug halfway to his lips. What frequency? The question struck her as odd. 88.1. Why? Walter carefully folded his newspaper, a deliberate movement that Matty recognised as his way of buying time. That old transmitter picks up all kinds of interference. Probably just noise from the power lines. Power line noise doesn't transmit prime number sequences, Dad. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the ancient wall clock. Walter cleared his throat. Sometimes it's better not to broadcast what you hear, he said finally. Especially around here. What's that supposed to mean? Matty pressed. Walter stood, rinsing his mug at the sink. Just saying some signals aren't meant to be shared. He left for the fields before she could question him further, but his reaction only intensified her curiosity. What did her father know about a random radio frequency? Why would he care if she shared what she'd found? That afternoon, Matty drove into town, laptop tucked under her arm. The Granger Public Library was small but offered free Wi-Fi that wasn't linked to her home network. She uploaded her recordings again, this time to a more obscure forum dedicated to unexplained radio phenomena. Within an hour she had 3 responses. Definitely artificial. Pattern repeats exactly every 42.7 seconds. Looks like SETI stuff. Where exactly did you record this? Check your DMS. The direct message came from a user named RadioSilence_1977. Take this down immediately. They monitor these forums. 88.1 is part of Node 0. Not your discovery, not the first time. Call the number in your area that ends with 3333 if you need to understand why this matters. Matty stared at the message, a chill running through her despite the summer heat. She started typing a response when the library's internet connection suddenly dropped. The librarian announced they were experiencing technical difficulties. By the time Matty returned home, her forum post had vanished too. That evening, as sunset painted the cornfields in golden shadow, Matty noticed something unusual from her bedroom window. A utility truck parked at the edge of their property. 2 men in matching grey uniforms stood beside it, looking toward the house. Though too distant to see clearly, something about their synchronised movements seemed unnatural, as if they were mirrors of each other. When she blinked, they were gone. The truck, too. Only empty road remained. At exactly 3:33 a.m, Matty sat in the equipment shed, headphones on, the radio tuned to 88.1 FM. The signal returned, stronger tonight, its pulsing rhythm somehow more urgent. The mathematical sequences had evolved, growing more complex. In the distance, she could have sworn she heard the cornstalks rustling in perfect synchronization with the beat. Matty woke to the sound of her computer rebooting, the distinctive startup chime jolting her from sleep. The clock on her nightstand read 3:33 a.m. She hadn't set an alarm. Rubbing sleep from her eyes, she watched as her screen flashed to life, opened a blank document, and displayed a single line of text. Not for you to hear. The cursor blinked rhythmically before the computer shut itself down. Matty sat frozen, heart hammering in her chest. She hadn't touched the keyboard. She hadn't even been near the computer. Morning brought no clarity, only more questions. While checking the fence line after breakfast, she discovered a perfect circle in the cornfield, about 10 feet in diameter, where the stalks lay flat against the ground, spiralling inward toward a centre point. The corn wasn't broken or damaged, just uniformly bent as if pressed down by an invisible hand. "Dad!" she called out, finding Walter inspecting an irrigation pump nearby. "Come look at this." Her father approached slowly, his face unreadable as he surveyed the formation. "Wind damage," he said flatly. "Wind doesn't create perfect circles with mathematical precision," Matty argued, "and it doesn't just happen to show up after I record that signal." Walter sighed heavily. "Leave it alone, Matty. Please." "Why won't you tell me what you know about this?" She gestured toward the flattened corn. "This isn't normal, and you're acting like it's just another Tuesday." Her father removed his cap, running a hand through thinning grey hair. "I worked radar systems before I inherited this farm. Air Force, 1985 to 1991. stationed up at the North Dakota border most of that time. This wasn't news to Matty, but his tone suggested he was building to something important. There were frequencies we were told never to acknowledge, he continued. Signals that appeared on our scopes that we logged as equipment malfunction, even when we knew better. The brass called them ambient anomalies. We called them visitors. Matty stared at him. Are you saying you detected UFOs? I'm saying some things in this world speak in ways we're not meant to understand. And answering back, he paused, looking directly at her. That's when trouble starts. Before she could press further, the distant sound of a vehicle drew their attention. The same utility truck from yesterday approached along the access road, moving unhurriedly. Go inside, Walter said quietly. Who are they? Don't know, don't want to, just go. Matty retreated to the house, but watched from the kitchen window as her father met the truck at the end of their driveway. Two men emerged, identical in height and build, wearing matching grey uniforms. Even from this distance, their movements seemed eerily coordinated. They spoke briefly with Walter, who nodded several times. One of them handed him what appeared to be a business card. Then they departed, the truck disappearing down the dusty road. Walter returned to the house, his expression troubled. Electric company, he said, before Matty could ask. Checking lines. In matching uniforms with synchronized walks? Come on, Dad. He placed the card on the counter. It was blank except for a phone number, one that ended in 3333. Sometimes, Walter said carefully, it's better to ask permission than forgiveness. That afternoon, while her father napped, Matty drove to the Granger Historical Society, a glorified storage room attached to the town hall. The elderly volunteer seemed surprised to have a visitor. Looking for information on any radio stations or transmission towers that might have operated around here, Matty explained, especially during the Cold War. The woman pursed her lips. That'd be the old emergency broadcast station, I suppose. Closed down in 97 or thereabouts. Never did much broadcasting that I recall. Where was it located? About 8 miles north of town. Nothing left now but the foundation. With directions in hand, Matty found the site easily enough. A concrete slab obscured by weeds, with the rusted remains of a tower anchor still visible. What caught her attention, however, was what lay beneath. A sealed metal hatch, its surface weathered but intact, emblazoned with faded government markings. She photographed everything, particularly the designation stenciled on the hatch. ARCS Node 0. Back home, Matty began researching ARCS, and found sparse references to the Agricultural Region Communication System, ostensibly created to warn rural communities of nuclear threats. But one declassified document mentioned passive monitoring capabilities and anomalous frequency capture. She expanded her search to include other similar stations and discovered something remarkable. Satellite maps showed 6 former ARCS stations formed a perfect hexagon across Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota, with Granger precisely at its centre. That night, at 3:33 a.m., the signal returned, stronger, clearer. But this time, embedded within its mathematical pattern was something new. Her name, converted to binary code. The signal knew who was listening. As dawn broke, Matty found a note slipped under the front door. Do not transmit. It hers. Later that morning, while checking the cattle, she noticed they were huddled at the far end of the pasture, as far from the corn as possible. Their behaviour was unusual, heads lowered, refusing to graze despite the lush grass. When she tried approaching them, they backed away, eyes wide with unmistakable fear. By noon, the corn had changed. Subtle at first, just a slight variance in the direction of growth. But as Matty walked the rows, she realised entire sections were now growing in clockwise spirals rather than straight lines. The stalks twisted around each other in patterns that mimicked the frequency readouts from her computer. She tried calling the number on the blank card. A mechanical voice answered, reciting what sounded like random numbers before disconnecting. When she redialed, a different voice answered, human this time, but strangely flat. Connor's residence, 88.1 observation, the voice stated, not a question. Who is this? Matty demanded. How do you know my frequency? Your frequency? The voice sounded almost amused. It's been transmitting since 1941. You're just the newest receiver. The line went dead. When Walter returned from town with supplies, Matty confronted him with her discoveries. What's Node 0, Dad? What's really under that concrete slab north of town? Her father's shoulders sagged. I signed papers, Matty. We all did. Everyone who's owned this land since the 40s. Signed what? Easement agreements, monitoring rights. He gestured vaguely toward the corn. They said it was dormant, hasn't sent a readable signal in decades. Who's they? People who know enough to be afraid, Walter answered, and smart enough not to interfere. That night Matty dreamed of cornfields that moved like ocean waves, pulsing in rhythm to an unseen heartbeat. In the dream, she walked to the centre of their property where the ground began to split open, revealing not soil but a vast mechanical eye, ancient yet somehow alive, peering up at the stars. She awoke to find her bedroom filled with a pale blue light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. Her computer screen showed spectrogram patterns forming and dissolving without input. In the corner of her room stood two identical silhouettes, the men from the utility truck, though she hadn't heard anyone enter the house. She's resonating now, one said, voice oddly distorted. Becoming antenna, the other replied. Matty reached for the bedside lamp, but the figures were gone before the light came on. The locals called it pressure front weather, that peculiar stillness before a storm when the air feels charged with anticipation. But the clouds gathering over Granger that morning carried no rain, only an unnatural darkness that seemed to absorb the sunlight. Matty stood on the porch, watching barn swallows dart nervously across the sky before disappearing entirely. Even the insects had gone quiet. The corn, however, hadn't stopped its strange transformation, now growing nearly 6 inches taller than normal, with stalks that twisted toward the centre of the property instead of reaching for the sun. Her phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. The pattern completes today. Stay indoors after sunset. She tried responding, but the message bounced back as undeliverable. Walter had left before dawn for a farm supply auction in Des Moines, leaving Matty alone with her mounting questions and the increasingly alien landscape of their once familiar farm. She decided it was time to find answers elsewhere. The Granger Public Library's local history section was modest, but contained yellowed newspaper archives dating back to the 1930s. Matty requested everything they had about the founding of the emergency broadcast station. Funny you should ask, the librarian said, retrieving a dusty folder. Someone else was looking into those old stations just last month, left this research behind. The folder contained photocopied articles about the station's construction in 1941, alongside what appeared to be handwritten research notes in Cyrillic script. Clipped to these was a faded black and white photograph showing 7 men in military uniforms standing before the partially constructed radio tower. On the back, someone had written, Joint Monitoring Initiative, US-USSR, 1941. This can't be right, Matty muttered. The Americans and Soviets weren't allies until months after Pearl Harbor, which happened in December 1941. Yet this photo was dated April 1941, 8 months earlier. Stranger still was the diagram that fell from between the pages, a technical schematic labelled Receiving Configuration, Subterranean Frequency Capture. The drawing showed the radio tower's foundations extending far deeper than necessary, connecting to what appeared to be a pre-existing underground structure. As she photographed these documents with her phone, Matty noticed a sealed envelope tucked into the folder's pocket. Inside was a handwritten letter, the paper brittle with age. August 15th, 1982. To whoever finds this account, my name is Alexei Baranov, formerly captain of Soviet Air Defense Forces. I am what your government calls a defector, Though I did not leave for politics or freedom. I left because both our nations lie about what sleeps beneath your American heartland. In 1982, I was assigned to a joint monitoring project, officially designated as atmospheric research, but our true purpose was to track signals from an object discovered in 1926. American farmers found it after a meteorite impact, except it was no meteorite. The object was manufactured, ancient, and buried far deeper than any natural impact could explain. Neither government wished to acknowledge it publicly. Instead, they built a network of listening posts disguised as rural radio stations. 6 stations to triangulate, with Granger at the centre. For decades, the object remained dormant, emitting only faint pulses at regular intervals, like a heartbeat in hibernation. But something has changed. The mathematicians say the pattern is evolving, becoming more complex. The object is waking up. It sends signals outward now, not just to our stations, but to the stars. I write this because I believe people deserve warning. When the pattern completes, when it establishes the connection it seeks, I fear what might answer. If you are reading this, look to the fields. They will change first. A.B. Mattie's hands trembled as she folded the letter. The date, 1982, coincided with her father's early Air Force service. Had he known about this all along? Outside the library, the strange weather had intensified. The sky had darkened to a greenish copper hue that typically preceded tornadoes, yet the air remained perfectly still. Her phone showed no service, and the town seemed eerily deserted for a weekday afternoon. As she drove back toward the farm, Mattie noticed something impossible. The cornfields along the highway had changed direction since morning. Miles of crops that had previously grown in conventional rows now formed elaborate spiral patterns visible even from ground level. The effect was disorienting, creating optical illusions that made the landscape appear to breathe. The utility truck waited at her driveway, the identical men standing motionless beside it. This time Mattie didn't avoid them. She parked directly in front and got out. "Who are you really?" she demanded. "What's happening to our farm?" The men regarded her with identical blank expressions. Up close, their similarities were even more unsettling. Not just their builds and uniforms, but their faces shared the same flat affect, as if emotions were concepts they'd only recently encountered. "Resonance testing," one said. "Calibration complete," added the other. "That doesn't tell me anything," Mattie pressed. "What's underneath our farm? What's ARCS Node 0? The first man tilted his head. "Not what? Who?" "It was always listening," said the second. "Now it's answering." "Answering what?" The question it was sent to ask. They handed her another blank card, this one containing only geographic coordinates. Without another word, they returned to their truck and drove away. Mattie entered the coordinates into her phone's map application. They matched the exact centre of their property, a spot where the corn grew tallest, where the spiral patterns converged. By the time she reached the house, the sun had nearly set, casting long shadows through the twisted cornfields. The coordinates led to a section they rarely farmed, a slight depression that tended to flood during heavy rains. Her father had always avoided planting there, claiming the soil was poor. Now she understood why. The ground at the centre had changed, the soil darkening to an almost metallic sheen. As twilight deepened, the dirt began to emit a faint luminescence, pulsing with the same rhythm as the radio signal. Mattie's phone chimed with a text from her father. "Don't go near the centre field. Coming home now." Too late. She was already standing at the edge of the depression, watching as the ground continued its transformation. The dirt was shifting, revealing glimpses of something solid underneath. Something with geometric patterns etched into its surface. Her phone rang. Unknown caller. "Matilda Connors," said a voice she recognised from her earlier call. "You need to leave immediately. The pattern completes at 3:33. "What happens then?" she asked. It finishes constructing the receiver, and then it waits for instructions. From who? A pause. We don't know. That's what scares us. The ground beneath her feet trembled slightly, and Mattie stepped back as a section of soil collapsed, revealing a small portion of what lay beneath, a metallic surface with inscribed symbols that resembled mathematical equations. The exposed section pulsed with soft blue light, the same colour that had filled her bedroom nights before. Her phone's screen flickered, then displayed a single message. Coordinates matched. Receiver identified. As darkness fell completely, Mattie noticed something else. The stars above the farm were disappearing one by one, as if being systematically erased from the night sky. In their place, a subtle pattern was forming in the darkness, the same spiral configuration she'd seen in her spectrogram analysis. At precisely 3:33 a.m, every electronic device on the farm activated simultaneously. The house lights, her computer, the old radio transmitter in the shed, each emitted the same pulsing pattern, now loud enough to feel in her chest. The ground at the centre of the depression split open like a blooming flower, soil falling away to reveal more of the object beneath, a vast circular disk of impossible age, its surface covered in mathematical symbols that rearranged themselves as she watched. From this exposed section, a beam of coherent light shot straight upward into the night sky, piercing the spiral void where stars had been. The transmission had begun. Walter's truck skidded to a halt in the driveway, headlights illuminating Mattie's frozen figure at the field's edge. He ran toward her, panic evident in every movement. "Get back to the house," he shouted over the now audible hum emanating from the exposed disc. "It's not safe." Mattie couldn't move, transfixed by the beam of light connecting Earth to sky. "What is it, Dad? Really?" Walter reached her side, breathless. "They called it a beacon when I was stationed at the monitoring facility. Supposedly dormant for millennia until a lightning strike partially activated it in 1926. They built the listening posts to study it without disturbing it further." "They who?" "Started as a joint Soviet-American project before the Cold War, later expanded to include others, scientists, military, people who understood the implications." The humming intensified, and the beam of light widened, creating a cylindrical column that distorted everything seen through it. The air within seemed to bend, creating impossible geometries. "We need to go," Walter insisted, tugging her arm. "They're evacuating everyone within the zone." Tonight, I'll be your guide on a journey into one of the coldest and most enduring mysteries of the Cold War era. I want you to picture this. It's a winter night deep in the Ural Mountains in 1959. A group of young adventurers huddles in a tent on the snowy slope of a peak ominously called Dead Mountain. They're laughing, jotting down journal entries by flashlight, and planning tomorrow's trek. They don't know it yet, but this will be their last night alive. This is the true story of the Diatlov Pass incident, a mystery that has haunted investigators for decades. My name is James, and I've spent weeks poring over old case files, diaries, and witness reports about what happened to those 9 hikers in 1959. The more I dig, the more the Diatlov Pass incident feels like a nightmare straddling the line between fact and fiction. So, let's delve into it together step by step as if we're investigators unravelling a case file. The story begins in late January 1959. 10 experienced ski hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on an expedition to reach a mountain called a Torten in the northern Urals. They were all in their early 20s, 7 men and 2 women, except for one older instructor, and were led by a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Diatlov. On January 23, 1959, the Diatlov group received their route book and left the city of Sverdlovsk, today's Yekaterinburg, by train. You can imagine them on that train, excited, full of youthful bravado, maybe singing along to a mandolin one of them brought for the journey. After 2 days on trains, the party reached Ivdel, a remote town at the edge of the northern Ural Mountains, which also housed a Soviet Gulag camp for criminals. From Ivdel, they travelled by bus and then hitched a ride in the back of a woodcutter's truck to a settlement called Vijay, the last inhabited village to the north. The locals in Vijay must have looked at these university students with a mix of admiration and concern. The route they planned to traverse was rated Category 3, the most difficult, and they were attempting it in February, the cruelest time of year. On January 27th, the Diatlov group left Vijay and began their trek into the wilderness. One member, Yuri Yudin, had been struggling with health issues. He had rheumatism and a congenital defect that caused knee pain. By January 28th, Yudin's joint pain became too severe. Reluctantly, he turned back toward Vijay, unable to continue. He had no idea that by saving himself, he was sealing his fate as the expedition's sole survivor. Yuri Yudin would never see his friends alive again. The remaining 9 hikers pressed on into the wild, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Through diaries and photographs recovered later, investigators have pieced together their route. By January 31st, the group had reached the edge of a highland area and cached surplus food and equipment in a wooded valley to be used for the return trip. They joked around, took photos, and even made a little mock newspaper they titled the Evening Autoton, in which one entry humorously proclaimed, "From now on, we know that the snowmen exist," likely a tongue-in-cheek reference to local Yeti legends. Despite the exhaustion and cold, their spirits were high. On February 1st, the team started to move through a mountain pass, later named Diatlov Pass after this incident, with the plan to camp on the other side that night. But the weather turned on them. A howling snowstorm and blinding wind caused Diatlov's team to lose their direction on the barren slopes. Instead of crossing the pass into the shelter of the valley beyond, they had veered west, finding themselves on the flank of a mountain called Kholat Shakal, which in the local Mansi language means dead mountain. By the time they realised their mistake, it was late in the day and visibility was near zero from the blowing snow. Rather than descend 1.5 kilometres down into the forest for cover, Igor Diatlov decided to pitch their tent right there on the mountainside in the open. Perhaps he didn't want to lose the altitude they'd gained, or perhaps he wanted to prove they could handle camping on an exposed slope in a blizzard. The 9 of them set up their large tent on the bare snow, chopping into the slope for a flat spot. It was a decision that would be heavily scrutinised later. That evening of February 1st, 1959 must have been brutal. Temperatures were around minus 20 degrees Celsius, and winds roared over the pass. Still, inside the tent, the group was relatively secure. They had a warm dinner. Later forensic analysis of their stomach contents showed they ate around 6 to 7 p.m. In one of the last photos recovered from their cameras, they are seen joking and smiling as they set up camp in the twilight on February 1st. Despite the extreme cold and howling wind outside, they seemed in good spirits, jotting down journal entries and chatting as they settled in for the night. They could not have imagined the terror that was coming. Something happened in the dark early hours of February 2nd that changed everything. We don't have eyewitnesses to describe it. All we have is the evidence left behind, and that evidence reads like the opening scene of a horror film. Sometime after midnight, the tent was suddenly slashed open from the inside. The 9 campers, who had been sleeping or resting, burst out of their tent into a howling snowstorm in the pitch black of night. They left behind almost all their gear, boots, coats, hats, sleeping bags, axes, as if fleeing an imminent threat. Imagine the situation. It's minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, outside, and yet something scared or startled them so badly that they ran out half-dressed and barefoot into the blizzard. Why? What could have terrified them, or otherwise compelled them to abandon their only shelter and run into certain death? That's the question investigators have grappled with for over 60 years. When the group failed to return to Vijay by February 12th as planned, there wasn't immediate alarm. Delays of a few days were common for such expeditions. But as day after day passed with no word, the hikers' families grew anxious. By February 20th, the relatives demanded a search and rescue operation. The Ural Polytechnic Institute sent student volunteers to scour the route, and soon the Soviet army and local militia police joined in, with planes and helicopters dispatched to aid the search. Rescuers faced brutal weather themselves, traversing deep snow and scanning miles of desolate terrain. Among the searchers was a student named Mikhail Sharavin, who on February 26th would make a chilling discovery. On February 26th, 1959, Sharavin's search team was moving along the slopes of Kolatchakal when he spotted something odd sticking out of the snow. As they got closer, they realised it was a corner of the missing group's tent, collapsed and half buried in the snow. Sharavin used an ice pick to hack open the tent's entrance, which was blocked with snow. The sight inside the tent baffled him. The tent's canvas had been slashed open from the inside with a knife, and although it was damaged and partially snow-filled, almost all the hiker's belongings were still neatly arranged inside. He found blankets and coats laid out, a row of boots, axes and flashlights set to the sides, a map and official papers, a little pile of money and even a flask of alcohol. In one corner was a plate with slices of sayalo, pork fat, as if someone had been in the middle of fixing a snack. It was like a snapshot frozen in time. The tent felt orderly, not like it had been ripped apart by an external force. Sharavin later said it was as if the campers had been interrupted in the middle of dinner, then fled in a rush. The scene sent shivers down his spine. Why would experienced hikers cut open their only shelter and run away without boots or coats? Outside the tent, the search team found footprints in the snow, and they only deepened the mystery. There were 9 sets of prints, which matched the number of missing hikers. They could see the impressions of feet wearing only socks, or a single shoe, and some barefoot. You could even make out toe marks in the frozen snow. The tracks indicated that the hikers had not run in a wild panic, but rather walked fast or at a hurried shuffle down the slope, in an organised single file. The rescuers followed these tracks downhill in the direction of a dense forest. Incredibly, the footprints continued for about 500 metres before they were obscured by fresh snow. It was as if the group had intentionally headed toward the forest, perhaps seeking shelter or regrouping. Sharavin and the others were utterly perplexed. What on earth could have made these seasoned hikers leave their tent in sub-zero cold, partially dressed and even barefoot, walking away calmly into the night? With dusk approaching on February 26th, the searchers had to pause the search until morning, haunted by the enigma they'd uncovered. The next day, the search parties fanned out from the tent down toward the forest. At the forest's edge, under a large Siberian cedar tree, Sharavin and his comrades found the charred remains of a small fire. Near that fire lay the first 2 bodies. What they saw defied explanation. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko were found side by side in the snow, shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. The branches on the cedar above them were broken up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed up into the tree. Indeed, bits of skin and torn clothing were found on the bark. It looked like one of them had frantically clambered up the cedar, either to get a better view of the area, perhaps trying to spot the tent in the dark, or to escape something. Krivonishenko's corpse had burns on parts of his body, and in a grim detail he had a piece of flesh missing from his right hand. It turned out he had bitten off a chunk of his own knuckle, possibly in an attempt to stay conscious or stifle a scream while dying of cold. Both men's hands and feet were deep reddish-brown, a sign of frostbite, and maybe the last attempt to warm their limbs by the fire. The tree's branches had been stripped for kindling, but the fire they managed to build was small and had burned out by the time they died. The image of these 2 friends huddled by a dead fire, slowly freezing to death in their underwear under a sky of endless black, is something I can't easily shake off. About 300 metres away from the cedar tree, toward the tent, the searchers found the body of Igor Diatlov. He was lying face up in the snow, head oriented toward the tent up the slope, as if he had been trying to crawl back that way. Diatlov was better dressed than the 2 under the tree. He wore a flannel shirt, a sweater, and pants, but notably, he had no coat and no boots, only socks on his feet. One arm was frozen upright, reaching toward the sky, clutching a small birch branch. His other hand was pressed to his chest. People who saw his body remarked that he appeared to be protecting something in his jacket or close to his heart. Perhaps a photograph or his notebook, though nothing of note was found on his chest. His face, when they cleared the snow, was strangely calm, eyes open. Not far from Diatlov, searchers found Zenaida Zina Kolmogorova, the 22-year-old female student in the group. Zina was better dressed than Igor. She had on 2 sweaters and 2 pants, but she too lacked boots, wearing only socks. Her body was turned toward the tent and her arms were extended forward, bent at the elbows, as if she had been crawling uphill on her stomach, desperately trying to get back to the tent before the cold overtook her. On Zina's right side, the searchers noted a long, bright red bruise running along her torso, resembling a blunt force injury from a baton or the butt of a rifle. It was an odd injury to see, given that she had no other major external wounds. It took a few more days until March 5th to find Rustem Slobodin, the last of these first 5 bodies. Slobodin, 23, was discovered face down in the snow about 480 metres from the cedar, roughly halfway back toward the tent. He was dressed more warmly than the others. He had a long-sleeve undershirt, a sweater, 2 pairs of pants, 4 pairs of socks, and 1 felt-lined boot on his right foot, but his head was bare and his left foot was only in a sock. In his right hand, Slobodin clenched a small pocket knife, closed. An autopsy would later reveal that Slobodin had a fracture in his skull, about 7 inches long, consistent with a blunt impact. However, this crack in his skull was not deemed a fatal wound. The medical examiner thought Rustem could have sustained it during a fall and continued moving for at least an hour afterward. Like Diatlov, Kolmogorova, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, Rustem Slobodin ultimately died of hypothermia. In fact, the first 5 bodies found all had no life-threatening external injuries. They had perished from the unforgiving cold. Slobodin's watch was found shattered and stopped at 8:45, though it's unclear if that was 8:45 a.m. or p.m, or even 8:45 on a different date. It was as if time itself froze at that moment. Now imagine being Yuri Yudin, the one who had turned back, called in to identify the bodies of your friends. One by one, the first 5 corpses were airlifted to the morgue in Ivdel for autopsy and identification. Yudin, with a heavy heart, confirmed their identities. But 4 members of the Diatlov party were still missing. Weeks passed with no sign of them. The winter snows began to melt under the early spring sun. It wasn't until May, nearly 3 months later, that nature revealed the remaining victims, turning the mystery into something even more haunting. On May 4th, a Mansi tribesman named Kurin and his dog were assisting the search, when the dog picked up a scent near a rocky ravine further into the woods from the cedar tree. About 75 metres beyond the cedar and 1,500 metres from the tent, in a snow-filled ravine, searchers discovered a few torn pieces of clothing on a branch. Digging down, they uncovered the final 4 bodies buried under nearly 4 metres of snow. These were Lyudmila, Luda Dubinina, Semyon, Alexander, Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov. They were lying about 75 metres further into the forest from the cedar, at the bottom of that ravine. Notably, 3 of the 4 were better dressed than the others, and it appeared they had taken clothes from those who died earlier. Dubinina, for example, was found wearing Krivonishenko's torn and burned brown trousers, and her foot was wrapped in a piece of his wool sweater. Zolotaryov, the 38-year-old, was found wearing Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat. Kolovatov had put on a spare sweater and pants, likely from one of the others. This exchange of clothing suggests that when some members of the group died, the last survivors stripped the dead of usable clothing to keep themselves alive, a tragic but practical act of survival. But the condition of these 4 bodies deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Unlike the first 5, 3 of these 4 had fatal physical injuries that were utterly horrifying. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had suffered a massive skull fracture. His skull was literally crushed, the fracture measuring about 8 inches. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov both had their chests caved in, with multiple ribs broken on each side. Dubinina had 10 ribs fractured, and Zolotaryov had 5 ribs fractured. A forensic doctor who examined the bodies said that the force required to produce such injuries would have been extremely high, comparable to that of a car crash. In other words, something had delivered an immense pressure or impact to their bodies. Strangely, none of these three had any external wounds or bruises corresponding to the lethal internal damage. It was as if they'd been hit by a shockwave or squeezed by a tremendous force without breaking the skin. The fourth person in the ravine, Alexander Kolevatov, had a less clear cause of death. He had a broken nose, an open wound behind his ear, and a deformed neck, but his injuries were not as catastrophic as the others. It's believed Kolevatov also died of hypothermia, possibly after sustaining some trauma. And then there were the gruesome details that truly made this case infamous. All four of these people in the ravine had some form of soft tissue damage to the head and face that wasn't seen in the others. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and even a bit of her skull bone. Semyon Zolotaryov was missing his eyeballs, and Alexander Kolevatov was missing his eyebrows. These shocking injuries naturally gave rise to lurid theories. Was the group attacked by someone or something that ripped out tongues and eyes? However, the medical experts had a more mundane explanation. The four in the ravine were found in a stream bed. During the 3 months before they were found, water and scavenging animals likely caused the soft tissue of their faces to decompose or be eaten away. In Dubinina's case, the autopsy noted that her stomach contained about 100 grams of coagulated blood, suggesting her heart was still beating when her tongue was removed, meaning the tongue likely decomposed or was scavenged very soon after her death. As horrifying as these injuries sound, investigators believe they were post-mortem effects, not violence inflicted while alive. Still, when these details became public, they fueled wild speculation about murderous attackers or supernatural evil. It didn't help that Zolotaryov was found with a camera around his neck, different from the other cameras found in the tent, and his hand holding a pen and notepad, as if he died trying to write something down. Unfortunately, whatever he intended to note was never written. The pad was blank. The investigators in 1959 were at a loss to come up with a satisfying explanation for all this. A criminal inquest began as a matter of procedure, since several of the deaths involved injuries. They first suspected that the native Manatee people, reindeer herders of the region, might have attacked the campers for trespassing on sacred land. But that theory was quickly dispelled. The only footprints found at the scene were those of the hikers themselves, and there were no signs of hand-to-hand struggle on the bodies. In fact, the Mansi had helped in the search, and had no history of hostile encounters with hikers. Next, investigators considered an avalanche, but the pattern of the tent and the footprints suggested otherwise. We'll revisit that later. As for animal attack, no large animal tracks were found, and the violent injuries didn't have the telltale marks of claws or teeth. The Soviet authorities were left to conclude that no other humans were involved in the Diatlov group's demise. One of the doctors famously commented that the force which killed Dubinina and Zolotaryov was more than any human could inflict. No human could be powerful enough to cause such damage. One piece of information emerged that added a strange Cold War twist. When the forensic analysts tested the hikers' clothing, they found unusual levels of radiation on some of the garments. Specifically, Dubinina's brown sweater and Krivonishenko's wool pants were found to be radioactive. This discovery didn't make sense in a hiking context, and was not something the average person could detect. It was only found because one investigator had access to a Geiger counter. The presence of radiation fueled speculation that the Diatlov party had encountered some secret weapon or radioactive fallout. However, a closer look provided a more ordinary explanation. Yuri Krivonishenko had previously worked at the Mazak nuclear facility and was involved in cleaning up a major nuclear accident in 1957, the Kishtim disaster. It's very possible his clothes were contaminated from that event and still carried traces of radiation. Likewise, Alexander Kolevatov had studied nuclear physics and worked at a secret institute in Moscow, which might explain contamination on some items. In short, the radiation might not have had anything to do with the incident. It could have been a red herring. Still, the fact that their skin reportedly had a deep tan and some of their hair had turned grey when relatives saw the bodies only intensified rumours of some nuclear or chemical exposure. Authorities claimed the skin tanning was a natural mummification effect from lying in the sun and cold for weeks, and that hair can turn colour from exposure or the embalming process. But to grieving families in 1959, radioactive clothes and orange skin sounded like the stuff of government cover-ups and sci-fi nightmares. By May 1959, the official investigation was drawing to a close without a concrete answer. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was under pressure to wrap it up. In his final report, Ivanov wrote that the hikers died because of the effect of an unknown compelling force. It was a vague catch-all phrase, essentially admitting that they couldn't figure it out. No external culprits could be identified, and the case was therefore closed without any criminal charges. The files were stamped secret and filed away in a Soviet archive. The Diatlov Pass area was also declared off-limits to other expeditions for the next 3 years, supposedly to prevent any more tragedies, though some see it as an attempt to keep curious eyes away. The inquest's official finding was that the group members died due to a compelling natural force, a phrase that raised more questions than it answered. Imagine the weight of that silence. 9 young lives lost, and their families were told they would never know exactly how or why. In the Soviet Union of 1959, that was that. Some of the parents and siblings sensed a cover-up. Zina Kolmogorova's mother, for instance, and Igor Diatlov's parents all received hushed warnings from officials. The families were explicitly told, "You will never know the truth, so stop asking questions." In those days, if the party or KGB told you to be quiet, you stayed quiet, out of fear. So the families buried their children without knowing what really happened, and the Diatlov incident faded into an eerie Cold War legend whispered about in Ural classrooms and mountaineering clubs. As for Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor who wasn't even there, he lived the rest of his life with survivor's guilt and a burning desire to find the truth. Yudin repeatedly insisted that his friends did not die due to some simple natural accident. He felt in his gut that something else, something man-made, had to have caused it. In interviews before his death in 2013, Yuri Yudin openly voiced his belief that the Soviet authorities knew more than they let on about the incident. In fact, not long before he died, Yudin publicly stated that he believed his teammates had been taken out of the tent at gunpoint and murdered. He even speculated that Dubinina's tongue was cut out by perpetrators because she was the most outspoken of the group. These are incredibly serious accusations, and they were never proven. Yudin admitted he had no evidence, just deep suspicions after a lifetime of thinking about it. Whether Yudin was right or wrong, his perspective shows just how deeply the Diatlov mystery can burrow into someone's soul. So, here we are decades later, with more questions than answers. I'm a modern-day investigator, combing through the remnants of old reports and new theories. As I piece together each bit of evidence, I feel that cold wind from Dead Mountain blowing through the decades. The Diatlov Pass incident has become one of the world's most enduring mysteries, precisely because it sits at the crossroads of the explicable and the baffling. Over the years, numerous theories have been put forward to explain it, some grounded in scientific reasoning, others veering into the paranormal or conspiratorial. Let's examine these theories one by one, like branching investigative paths, and see where each leads. Keep in mind, any good explanation must account for all the odd details we've discussed: the torn tent, the state of undress, the bizarre injuries, the radiation, the reports of strange lights in the sky, the secrecy. It's a tall order, but let's walk these paths together. The first path is the one that the Russian authorities themselves eventually settled on: an avalanche. For many, this is the most straightforward explanation. Picture the scenario. The Diatlov group is asleep in their tent on the slope, when suddenly a slab of heavy snow above them fractures and slides down onto the tent. The tent fabric begins to collapse and they hear the roar of snow. In a flash, the group panics. They believe a full avalanche is about to bury them. In seconds, they grab a knife, slash open the tent from the inside, because the entrance is blocked or hard to open under the weight of snow, and they flee into the night wearing whatever they had on at that moment. This theory gained significant traction, and in fact in 2019 to 2020 the Russian government reinvestigated Diatlov Pass and concluded that a slab avalanche was the official cause of death. Later that year, a team of scientists published new computer simulations supporting the plausibility of an avalanche. In this case, the most appealing aspect of the avalanche theory is that the hikers' actions no longer seem irrational under this lens. If you believe an avalanche is about to crush you, doing whatever it takes to get out of the tent and moving to safer ground is exactly the right response. And indeed, everything the Diatlov group did after leaving the tent can be seen as textbook survival behaviour once you assume an avalanche threat. The theory goes like this. A slab of snow, perhaps loosened by the wind or the heat from their stove earlier, slid and partially buried the tent, making loud cracks and rumbles. The experienced hikers immediately and calmly initiated an emergency evacuation. They cut their way out of the tent and headed for ground that would be safe from a larger avalanche, which in this case meant moving toward the tree line on the far side of the pass. They didn't take time to put on boots or grab equipment because every second mattered. In their minds, they had to get clear of the avalanche path. In just their socks and light clothes, they made it about a mile downslope to the forest. There they regrouped and tried to stay warm by building a fire. We saw evidence of that by the cedar. They also dug a snow cave as a shelter. The ravine where the last four were found had branches laid out on the floor, Hello there, fellow truth seekers. Before we dive into tonight's chilling tale, I hope you're having a wonderful day, wherever you are in this vast world of ours. Whether it's morning coffee time in New York, afternoon tea in London, or late night contemplation in Tokyo, we're all connected by our shared curiosity about the mysteries that lurk just beyond the veil of accepted reality. Speaking of time, what time is it where you're listening? And more importantly, where are you from? I love knowing that Sleep Theories reaches every corner of our planet, connecting minds across continents. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. We're building a community of people who aren't afraid to ask the difficult questions and explore the shadows where truth often hides. Now, settle in as we journey to one of the most remote and enigmatic places on Earth, Mount Hayes, Alaska. What you're about to hear are the recovered field notes of Dr. Sarah Chen, a geophysicist who thought she was studying a mountain until she realised the mountain was studying her. Field notes, Mount Hayes Geological Survey. Classification, redacted. Entry 1, March 15th, 2024, Day 1. The job offer. I should have known something was wrong when they offered me triple my usual rate. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and I'm a contract geophysicist. 23 years of mapping underground structures, analysing seismic data, and helping oil companies find black gold in impossible places. I've worked everywhere from the North Sea to the Sahara, but I've never been offered a job quite like this one. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing core samples from my last assignment in Montana. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and oddly urgent. Dr. Chen, this is Marcus Holloway from Meridian Aerospace Solutions. We have a project that requires your particular expertise in remote geological analysis. Meridian Aerospace. I'd heard the name whispered in certain circles, a private company with deep government contracts, the kind that didn't advertise their services or maintain public websites, the kind that made satellites disappear and asked no questions about why. "What's the location?" I asked, already reaching for my travel bag. Work had been slow lately, and my bank account was feeling the pinch. "Mount Hayes, Alaska, Eastern Alaska Range. We need a comprehensive geological survey of the subsurface structures within a 15-mile radius of the summit." Mount Hayes. Even I knew that name, though I couldn't immediately place why. Something about it triggered a vague memory, like a half-remembered dream that leaves you unsettled all day. "When do you need me there?" "Tomorrow." The money was too good to refuse. 60,000 for a 2-week survey, plus expenses, plus a completion bonus that would clear my student loans and then some. I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered why they needed results so quickly, or why they were willing to pay so much for what seemed like routine geological work. Instead, I packed my seismic equipment and flew to Fairbanks. Entry 2, March 16th, 2024 Day 2, into the ice. The helicopter ride to the research outpost was my first clue that this wasn't going to be a normal assignment. Our pilot, a weathered Alaskan named Joe Reeves, kept glancing nervously at his instruments as we approached the mountain. The GPS flickered intermittently, and the radio crackled with static that seemed to pulse in regular intervals. "Funny thing about this mountain," Joe said over the headset, his voice tight. "Been flying these skies for 30 years, and my instruments always go screwy near Hayes. Not gradually, mind you, like someone's flipping a switch." Through the helicopter's window, Mount Hayes loomed ahead of us, a massive, snow-covered peak that seemed to dominate the entire horizon. At 13,832 feet, it's the highest mountain in the Eastern Alaska Range, but it wasn't its height that made my breath catch. There was something about its profile, something almost geometric in the way the ice caught the light, that made it look less like a natural formation and more like architecture. "Ever been up there yourself?" I asked Joe. He shook his head quickly. "Local folks won't go near it. Say machines go dead near the peak, that the ice sings at night." He paused, adjusting his grip on the controls. Of course, locals say a lot of things, but I've lost 2 drones trying to get close-up footage of that summit. Just stopped responding. Never found the wreckage. The research outpost was little more than a cluster of prefabricated buildings connected by enclosed walkways, situated on a flat expanse of tundra about 15 miles from Mount Hayes. As we landed, I could see the mountain clearly in the distance, a white sentinel against the grey sky, deceptively peaceful. The team was small: myself, a communications specialist named David Park, and a senior researcher named Dr. Elena Vasquez, who seemed to know more about the project than she was letting on. Elena had the kind of pale, intense look that comes from spending too much time staring at classified documents in windowless rooms. "Welcome to Site Echo," she said as Joe's helicopter disappeared into the distance. "I trust your flight was educational." That first night, as I set up my equipment and reviewed the survey parameters, I noticed something odd about the project documentation. Most geological surveys come with extensive background research, geological history, previous surveys, mineral composition analyses. Our files contained almost nothing, just GPS coordinates, a rough topographical map, and a single sentence of instruction. Locate and map all artificial structures within subsurface detection range. Artificial structures in a mountain that had been formed by tectonic forces millions of years ago. I should have asked more questions then, but the money was good, and I'd seen stranger things in my career. Oil companies sometimes got mysterious about their target locations, especially when they suspected there might be rare earth minerals involved. I went to sleep that first night to the sound of wind howling across the tundra, and beneath it something else, a low, almost subliminal humming that seemed to come from the direction of the mountain. Entry 3, March 18th, 2024. Day 4, the signal beneath. The first seismic readings were impossible. I've been doing this work for over 2 decades. I know what bedrock looks like on a seismic scan. I know the signature of natural caves, underground rivers, mineral deposits, and oil reserves. What I was seeing in the data from Mount Hayes was none of those things. The reading showed a vast hollow space beneath the mountain, roughly 2 miles down and extending in all directions from the central peak. But it wasn't a natural cave system. The walls were too regular, too geometric. The acoustic properties suggested smooth, artificial surfaces that reflected sound waves in patterns I'd never seen before. More disturbing were the frequency readings. Every few hours my instruments would detect a deep rhythmic pulse emanating from somewhere beneath the mountain. Not seismic activity. The frequency was wrong for that. This was something else. Something that seemed almost deliberately timed. "David," I called to our communications specialist who was monitoring radio traffic from the main cabin. "Are you picking up any unusual transmissions? Low frequency, regular intervals?" He looked up from his equipment, frowning. "Funny you should ask. I've been getting interference on almost every channel since we arrived. Started yesterday around noon. Sounds like..." He paused, adjusting his headphones. "Well, it sounds like code, but not any code I recognise." Dr. Vasquez emerged from her office, where she'd been spending most of her time on encrypted satellite calls. "What kind of code?" David played back a recording. Through the speakers came a series of low, pulsing tones, regular as a heartbeat, but complex in their pattern. Dot dash, dot dot dash. Pause. Dot dot dash dot. Pause. The sequence repeated 3 times, then went silent for exactly 4 minutes before starting again. "It's not Morse," David said. "At least not standard Morse, but there's definitely a pattern to it." Elena's face had gone very pale. "When did this start?" "About 6 hours after Dr. Chen began her deep seismic scanning." Elena and I exchanged a look. In my experience, timing like that wasn't coincidental. That night, as I reviewed the day's data, I noticed something else disturbing. My equipment wasn't just detecting the hollow space beneath Mount Hayes, it was detecting movement within that space. Small, regular fluctuations in the acoustic readings suggested something was moving around down there, something large enough to displace air and create pressure waves that registered on my instruments. I was so focused on the data that I almost missed David's panicked call from the communications cabin. "Dr. Chen, you need to see this. Now." I found him staring at his infrared monitoring screen, which showed a real-time thermal image of Mount Hayes. The mountain appeared as a cold, blue-white mass against the warmer background, exactly as you'd expect. But there were patches of warmth scattered across the glacial surface, small moving heat signatures that seemed to be travelling in deliberate patterns across the ice. "Could be wildlife," I suggested, though I knew it wasn't. "At 13,000 feet, in the middle of a glacier?" David shook his head. "And look at the movement pattern." He was right. The heat signatures weren't moving randomly like animals would. They were following precise geometric paths, tracing patterns across the ice that looked almost like circuit boards or neural networks. "It's not an echo," David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a beacon." Entry 4, March 20th, 2024, Day 6. The Stargate Files. I couldn't sleep. The data made no sense, and Dr. Vasquez's increasingly secretive behaviour was setting off every alarm bell in my head. So I did what any curious scientist would do. I started digging. The Research Outpost server contained the usual collection of geological databases, weather monitoring systems and communication logs. But buried in a subdirectory labelled Historical Research was a folder I hadn't noticed before. CRV-12B Hayes Site. The files inside changed everything. Project Stargate. I'd heard rumours about it in graduate school, a CIA program from the 1970s and 80s that used psychic remote viewers to spy on foreign governments and investigate paranormal phenomena. Most people assumed it was either a hoax or a failed experiment that had been quietly shut down. The documents in the folder suggested otherwise. Date: September 15th, 1983. Classification: Secret Nuforn. Subject: Remote viewing session. Target: Hayes anomaly. Viewer: Subject 12, Ingo Swan. Monitor: Dr. Harold Pathoff. Session transcript. Excerpt. Target appears to be a large artificial structure underground, very deep. I'm seeing metal, but not like our metal. Smoother. almost organic looking. There are beings here, tall, not human. They're watching something, watching us. I feel like they can sense me viewing them. This is not right. They're emitting something. Thoughts, signals, like radar but directed at consciousness itself. Session terminated at viewer's request. Additional notes from Dr. Puthoff. Subject 12 experienced severe psychological distress following this session. Reported persistent sensation of being watched for several weeks afterward. Recommend Hayes' target be classified as hostile and avoided in future operations. There were dozens of similar reports. Multiple remote viewers, all describing the same thing. A massive artificial structure buried deep within Mount Hayes, inhabited by non-human entities that seemed to be conducting some kind of surveillance operation. One report, dated 1985, contained a chilling detail. Viewer 7 described the entities as watchers who have been observing human development for an extended period. When asked about their purpose, viewer became distressed and reported receiving the telepathic message, "You're not ready to know, but you will be useful." The final document in the folder was a memo dated 1987, stamped with the logo of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Project Stargate findings regarding Mount Hayes have been forwarded to Majestic 12 for evaluation. Site is to be designated Delta 6 and placed under permanent monitoring. No civilian access permitted within 50-mile radius without special authorization. Remote viewing of target is hereby prohibited. I sat back in my chair, my hands shaking slightly as the implications sank in. We weren't here to conduct a routine geological survey. We were here to study something that the government had known about for decades. Something they'd been watching and hiding for over 40 years. And now, somehow, that something was sending signals. Entry 5. March 21st, 2024, Day 7. The mountain wakes. The phenomena intensified overnight. I woke to find David frantically adjusting his equipment, cursing under his breath as every GPS unit in the facility showed different coordinates for our location. According to the various devices, we were simultaneously in Alaska, northern Canada, and somewhere in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. "It's like something's jamming the satellites," he muttered, "but not randomly. It's forcing them to show specific false locations." Dr. Vasquez emerged from her quarters looking haggard, as if she hadn't slept at all. "We need to evacuate," she said, without preamble. "The situation has become unstable." "What situation?" I demanded. "Elena, what the hell is really going on here?" Before she could answer, the facility's proximity alarms began blaring. Something was approaching the outpost. Something large enough to trigger the motion sensors but invisible to our cameras. We rushed to the observation deck and stared out at the landscape. The tundra appeared empty, but our instruments insisted otherwise. The seismic readers showed massive movement beneath the ground, as if something enormous was travelling through the earth itself, heading directly toward us. Then the voices started. It began as a whisper, barely audible over the wind. But as we listened, the sound grew clearer. Human voices, dozens of them, all speaking in unison. The words were indistinct, but the rhythm was hypnotic, almost compelling. David ripped off his headphones with a gasp. "It's coming through the radio equipment. Every frequency, every channel. They're all saying the same thing." "What are they saying?" He looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. "Coordinates. They're repeating GPS coordinates over and over again." The coordinates led to a point on Mount Hayes, about 2 miles up the southeastern face. As we watched through binoculars, a section of the glacial ice began to crack and shift. Something was moving beneath the surface, something massive enough to fracture ice that had been solid for centuries. Dr. Vasquez grabbed my arm. "We have to leave, now before dash." She was interrupted by a sound that made my blood freeze, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from the mountain itself. The ice was singing, just as the locals had warned. But this wasn't the random sound of settling glaciers. This was music, complex and alien, that seemed to bypass the ears and vibrate directly in our bones. David suddenly stood up, his eyes glazed and unfocused. Without a word, he walked toward the exit. "David, where are you going?" I called after him. He didn't respond. Eleanor and I followed him outside, where we found him standing in the snow, staring at Mount Hayes with an expression of rapture. He was whispering the coordinates under his breath, over and over, like a mantra. It took both of us to drag him back inside, and even then he fought us, desperate to return to the snow and continue his vigil. When we finally got him sedated and secured, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. During our struggle, David had used his finger to write something in the condensation on the window. A series of symbols that weren't quite letters, weren't quite numbers, but somehow conveyed meaning directly to my brain. They have always been here. Entry 6, March 22nd, 2024, Day 8. Descent. Against Elena's frantic protests, I decided to investigate the crack in the glacier. The seismic readings were off the charts. Whatever was happening beneath Mount Hayes was building to some kind of crescendo, and every scientific instinct I possessed demanded that I document it. This was the discovery of a lifetime, evidence of non-human intelligence that had been hidden for decades. I loaded my portable equipment into a snowmobile and set out across the tundra toward the mountain. The closer I got to Mount Hayes, the stranger things became. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. The temperature readings from my instruments fluctuated randomly, sometimes showing tropical heat in the middle of an Alaskan winter. Most unsettling of all, I began to hear voices again. Not the unified chanting from the radio, but individual voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. Some sounded human, others didn't. The crack in the glacier was even more impressive up close, a fissure nearly 50 feet wide that descended into absolute darkness. But it wasn't the size that made me stop and stare. It was what I could see at the bottom of the crack. Metal. Smooth, seamless metal that reflected my flashlight beam in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The surface seemed to ripple and shift, as if it were liquid rather than solid, and embedded within it were structures that looked disturbingly organic, almost like neural pathways or blood vessels. I set up my camera equipment and began recording, documenting every detail of what I was seeing. The metal structure extended far beyond what my lights could illuminate, disappearing into the depths of the mountain. This wasn't a building or a machine. It was something else entirely, something that seemed to blur the line between technology and biology. As I worked, I became aware of a sensation I'd never experienced before. I felt, observed, not just watched, but studied, analysed, catalogued. Something was paying very close attention to me, and it wasn't human. The feeling intensified as I moved closer to the exposed metal surface. My instruments began picking up electromagnetic activity, unlike anything in my experience. Patterns of energy that seemed to pulse and flow like thoughts made visible. That's when I saw it. Deep within the metallic structure, barely visible in the reflected light of my camera, something moved. Something large and elongated, with what might have been limbs or appendages that moved with deliberate, intelligent purpose. I managed to capture nearly 30 seconds of footage before my equipment suddenly died. Every battery drained simultaneously, every circuit fried, every lens cracked as if exposed to extreme temperature variations. In the sudden darkness, with only the starlight reflecting off the ice, I heard a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life, assuming I have a rest of my life. It was breathing. Slow, deep, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from the metal structure itself. And beneath it, almost subliminal, was something that might have been laughter. Entry 7, March 23rd, 2024, Day 9, they've always been here. I barely made it back to the outpost. My snowmobile's engine died twice during the return journey, and I had to navigate by starlight after my GPS unit began displaying coordinates for locations on other planets. Elena was waiting for me with a satellite phone and an expression of grim resignation. "There's someone who wants to talk to you," she said. "Someone who's been waiting for this call for a very long time." The voice on the other end of the line was elderly, refined, and carried the weight of decades of classified knowledge. "Dr. Chen, my name is Doctor," Patricia Hamill. I was one of the original analysts for Project Stargate, and I've been monitoring the situation at Mount Hayes for the past 40 years. Monitoring what situation? The situation you've just become part of. Tell me, Doctor, what did you see in the glacier? I described everything. The metallic structure, the movement within it, the sensation of being observed. Dr. Hamill listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. What you've discovered isn't new, she said when I finished. Mount Hayes is one of 3 major observation stations that we've identified in the Northern Hemisphere. The others are located beneath the Greenland ice sheet and in the Siberian wilderness. We believe they've been there for millennia, possibly since before recorded human history. Observation stations? Observing what? Us, human civilization, our technological development, our social evolution, our potential as a species. Think of them as research stations, and we are the subjects. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You're telling me that we're being studied. By who? We don't know exactly. The remote viewers called them the Watchers. They appear to be non-human, highly intelligent, and possessed of technology that makes our most advanced systems look like stone tools. What we do know is that they've been influencing human development for centuries, perhaps longer. Influencing how? Subtle manipulations, electromagnetic fields that affect brain activity, frequency transmissions that influence decision-making processes. They've been guiding our species along specific developmental pathways, preparing us for something. Preparing us for what? There was a long pause before Dr. Hamill answered. We don't know, but we believe that whatever they're preparing us for is about to begin. The increased activity at Mount Hayes, the signals you've been detecting, these are signs that the observation phase is ending. And what comes next? Contact, direct contact, but not the kind that Hollywood has prepared us for. This won't be a peaceful exchange of knowledge between equals. This will be a harvesting. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Dr. Chen, you need to understand something very important. You didn't discover them. They allowed you to discover them. Every researcher who's found evidence of their presence has been specifically selected, either for their knowledge, their skills, or their psychological profile. You weren't studying Mount Hayes. Mount Hayes was studying you. I felt the world shift beneath my feet. What are you saying? I'm saying that you've been recruited, whether you know it or not. The question now is whether you're going to be useful to them voluntarily, or whether they're going to make you useful. The satellite phone went dead. Entry 8, March 24th, 2024, Day 10, the cut transmission. Elena disappeared sometime during the night. I found her quarters empty, her equipment gone, and no sign of struggle. The only trace of her presence was a note written in her precise handwriting. They called. I answered. Don't try to follow. David was still sedated, muttering coordinates in his sleep and occasionally writing symbols in the air with his finger. I tried to wake him, but his eyes remained unfocused, staring at something only he could see. I was alone in the facility, 15 miles from the nearest human settlement, with equipment that was failing at an accelerating rate. Every time I tried to establish communication with the outside world, the transmission would cut out or be replaced by that rhythmic pulsing tone. But I had to try. The world needed to know what was happening here. I spent the morning copying all of my data onto multiple drives, preparing redundant transmission packages, and setting up every communication method at my disposal. At 2:17 p.m, I began broadcasting on every available frequency. This is Dr. Sarah Chen, transmitting from Site Echo, Mount Hayes, Alaska. I am broadcasting evidence of non-human intelligence operating on Earth. If you are receiving this transmission, please relay this information to every scientific institution, government agency, and media outlet you can reach. The transmission lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds before the interference began. First static that gradually increased in volume. Then, beneath the static, voices, hundreds of them, all speaking in unison. They were speaking English this time. Dr. Chen, your work is complete. Please prepare for extraction. The facility's power grid fluctuated. lights dimming and brightening in rhythm with the voices. Outside, I could see shapes moving across the tundra toward the outpost. Tall, elongated figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. I tried to continue the transmission, but my voice was drowned out by the collective voices of the watchers. Your species has been prepared. The observation phase is concluded. Integration will begin shortly. Do not resist. Resistance is not compatible with your new purpose. The shapes were closer now. Close enough that I could see they weren't entirely physical. They seemed to exist partially in our reality, and partially somewhere else, flickering in and out of visibility like projections. My equipment was failing rapidly now. Screens going dark, hard drives corrupting, backup power systems shutting down one by one. But I managed to record one final message. If anyone receives this, understand that they've been watching us for longer than we can imagine. Mount Hayes is just one of their stations. There are others. Find them. Expose them. Don't let them. The transmission cut out as something massive settled onto the roof of the facility. The entire building shook, and through the skylights I could see something that defied description. Part machine, part organism, part something else entirely. The voices were inside my head now, no longer coming through the speakers, but speaking directly to my consciousness. You have been useful, Doctor, Sarah Chen. Your knowledge, your documentation, your psychological profile, all exactly as required. You will continue to be useful. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The neural interference was overwhelming, like trying to think through static. My vision blurred, and I felt my consciousness beginning to fragment. The last thing I remember clearly was looking out the window at Mount Hayes and realizing that the mountain itself was changing. The snow was sliding away from the peak, revealing the smooth, metallic surface beneath. It wasn't a mountain at all, it was a structure. A vast, ancient structure that had been masquerading as a natural formation for centuries. And it was opening. The peak split apart like a flower blooming, revealing an interior that pulsed with bioluminescent light. Things were emerging from within. Not ships, not creatures, but something that was both and neither. They rose into the sky in perfect formation, heading south toward the populated regions of Alaska, then beyond to the lower 48 states. The integration had begun. Final entry, timestamp corrupted. Note: the following text was found carved into the walls of the abandoned research facility by the recovery team. Forensic analysis indicates it was carved using fingernails. If you're reading this, I didn't make it out. They're not aliens, they're gardeners. We're the crop. The harvest has begun. Mount Hayes was just the beginning. Look for the signal. Listen for the frequency. But don't look too long. Don't listen too hard. Once you start paying attention, they start paying attention to you. The mountain remembers. The ice remembers. They've always been here. They've always been waiting. And now they're awake.